The morning was cold and wind-bitten when Rhett Callahan saddled his horse and rode out from the Callahan ranch. Frost laced the dry grass, and the horizon was the color of pewter, muted, sharp, and endless. He was a man who belonged to this land, tall, broad-shouldered, his jaw square as the fences he built, his heart locked behind years of loss and labor. The letter sat folded in his coat pocket, the one that reminded him why he rode this morning. It bore the name Henry Carter, a man who'd borrowed money 2 years ago to save his struggling farm. But Henry was dead now, leaving behind a debt that no one had paid. By law and contract, Rhett had the right to reclaim the land. By heart, he felt nothing. At least, that's what he told himself. He rode through the open country where the wind carried whispers of the past, his father's voice telling him that mercy had no place in business, that fairness was not softness, and that ranching was a game of survival. Rhett had lived by those words for years. He had built an empire from dust, with thousands of acres and herds that moved like rivers of muscle across the plains. He had everything a man could want, except peace. As the miles passed, he tried not to think about the faces that still haunted him, his late wife Mary, whose laughter used to fill the old ranch house, and the tiny grave out back marking the child they'd lost before he ever had a chance to hold him. Since then, Rhett had kept himself busy enough to forget. Debt collections, cattle sales, land deals, every transaction another layer of armor over a heart he refused to feel. The Hollow Creek homestead came into view by midday. The place was smaller than he remembered, its fences broken, its fields gone brown with neglect. The barn leaned to one side as though too tired to stand. Once this had been good land, lush pastures and a clean stream, but now it was little more than a memory of better times. He slowed his horse, the rhythmic clop of hooves breaking the heavy stillness. There was smoke from the chimney, thin and weak, and the faint cry of a child carried through the wind. That sound, unexpected and fragile, made him pause. He wasn't expecting anyone to still live here. Most widows left when the debts came due. He dismounted, boots crunching over frozen ground, and stepped toward the porch. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there. She couldn't have been more than 28 or 29, though the lines of hardship had already etched themselves into her face. A baby rested on her hip, eyes wide and glassy with hunger. Behind her, 4 more children peeked out, thin, barefoot, and silent. Her hair was the color of wheat left too long in the sun, her dress faded, her hands trembling slightly as she faced him. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked softly, though her eyes flickered with unease. Rhett hesitated for a moment before removing his hat. "I'm looking for Henry Carter's widow," he said, voice low and formal. Her lips parted, and she nodded. "I'm Clara Carter." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Rhett looked past her into the dim interior of the house. Bare shelves, no firewood stacked, and a pot on the stove that gave off no smell. He had seen poverty before, but this was desperation. "I came about the debt," he finally said. "Your husband borrowed a sum from me 2 years back." "It's come due." Clara didn't flinch. She just stood there, her chin lifting a little as though bracing for a blow. "I see," she whispered. "Then I suppose you've come to take the land." Rhett said nothing, but in his chest something stirred, a faint, unfamiliar ache. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and hunger. And for the first time in years, Rhett Callahan wasn't sure if he still knew the difference between what was right and what was human. The wind rattled the window panes as Rhett Callahan stood on the sagging porch of the Carter homestead, his gloved hand lowering his hat in quiet respect. The woman, Clara Carter, didn't move aside or invite him in. She just held her baby closer and met his gaze with a strange mixture of fear and pride. Inside, the smell of damp wood and cold ashes drifted out through the open doorway. Rhett had expected an empty house, a ledger to settle, and a key to claim. Instead, he found 5 pairs of eyes watching him from the dim interior. Children, thin as rails, faces pale from hunger. The oldest, a boy of maybe 10, tried to stand taller than he was, shielding his younger siblings as if he could protect them from whatever this stranger might do. Rhett cleared his throat, the words rough as gravel. "Ma'am, may I step inside?" Clara hesitated before nodding once. "Please," she said quietly, motioning toward the single chair near the fire. "It's not much warmer in here, but at least it's out of the wind." He stepped into the one-room cabin. The hearth held only a faint flicker of flame. Half-burned sticks gave off more smoke than heat. There was no smell of stew, no bread baking, only the faint sour scent of boiled roots. A wooden cradle rested near the wall, its occupant wrapped in worn quilts. Rhett's chest tightened. Clara laid the baby in the cradle and turned to face him. "You said you came about the debt," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Henry, he didn't tell me about it until near the end. He thought he'd have the crops to pay you back before winter, but the drought took everything." Rhett nodded grimly. "I remember the season. Half my own herd died from the heat." She folded her hands in front of her. "He worked himself into the ground, trying to make it right. He even sold his horse. But then he got sick and—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "When he passed, I found the note among his papers. I wanted to send word to you, but there was no money for postage." Rhett stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. By all accounts, she owed him everything: the land, the barn, the small plot by the creek. The law was clear. But the law didn't have to look into the eyes of 5 starving children. "Mrs. Carter," he began slowly, "I'm sorry for your loss, but the sum your husband owed wasn't small. I can't just—" "I understand," she interrupted gently. "You've every right to take the land. I won't stop you." She moved toward the corner and lifted a small tin box, the kind used for sewing supplies. From it she drew a gold ring, dull from wear. "This is all I have of value. It was my wedding ring. I can give you this and—" Rhett raised a hand. "No." The word came out sharper than intended. He took a breath, his tone softening. "Keep it." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't let the tears fall. "Then at least let me work for it," she insisted. "I can sew, cook, take in laundry. Give me a few months, and maybe I can earn part of what we owe." Rhett looked around again. The thin walls, the empty shelves, the small faces peeking from behind her skirts. Logic told him to refuse, to end this conversation and move on. Mercy whispered otherwise. Finally, he said, "I'll give you a week." She blinked, confused. "A week?" "To figure out what you want to do," he said. "I won't take the land, not yet." Clara nodded, shoulders sagging with both relief and fear. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." As he turned to leave, Rhett caught sight of the children again. The smallest clutching a rag doll missing an arm, the oldest standing tall despite the tremor in his jaw. He stepped out into the biting wind, feeling the weight of their silent stares follow him all the way to his horse. He had come to collect a debt. But as he rode away, the only thing he felt was a growing unease that maybe the debt he'd be paying wasn't one written on paper. It was one written on his conscience. Rhett Callahan didn't sleep well that night. The fire in his cabin burned low, and though the wind outside howled through the canyons, it wasn't the cold that kept him awake. It was the memory of that widow's eyes. Proud, weary eyes that hadn't begged for pity even as hunger gnawed at her and her children's ribs. He sat at his desk, the Carter debt ledger open before him. Numbers, neat and certain, marched across the page in his precise handwriting. $247 owed. 2 years overdue. The amount was small compared to his holdings, yet somehow it weighed heavier than any cattle drive or business deal he'd ever done. Rhett poured a glass of whiskey, though it did little to settle the unease twisting in his chest. For most of his life, he'd prided himself on fairness. He never took more than what was owed, and he never cheated a man of what was his. It was that principle that built his ranch, earned him respect, and kept his name clean in a land where greed often disguised itself as ambition. But tonight, fairness didn't feel the same as right. He saw again the sight of Clara Carter dividing a loaf of bread 6 ways, pretending she wasn't hungry. He'd noticed how her hands trembled as she tucked the smallest child's blanket tighter, how her lips pressed into a thin line as she told him she'd find a way to pay. He'd seen courage before, on battlefields of business, in storms that destroyed half his herd. But this was different. This was quiet courage, the kind that didn't shout or demand notice, the kind that suffered in silence. By morning, Rhett saddled his horse again and rode back toward Hollow Creek. The sun hung low and pale in the winter sky. He told himself he was just checking the boundaries of the land, seeing if anything could be salvaged once he took it over. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. When he arrived, the scene looked worse than he remembered. The barn roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the corral fence had collapsed. The door opened, and Clara appeared again, bundled in a thin shawl that did little against the biting wind. The baby was tied to her front with a strip of cloth, and her face was even paler than before. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted, cautious but polite. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "I came to look over the property," he said, dismounting. "See if there's anything to be done before you make arrangements." Her gaze flicked downward, and she nodded once. "I understand." Rhett walked the grounds in silence. What he found made his gut twist. Half-rotted feed, no livestock except one old goat, and not a single stack of firewood ready for the cold nights ahead. These people were surviving on willpower alone. When he returned to the porch, Clara stood waiting. The children peeked out from behind the doorframe again, their faces half hidden but curious. Rhett took in the sight of them, thin, frightened, but fiercely loyal to their mother, and felt something inside him crumble. "Mrs. Carter," he said finally, "if you need help, supplies or wood or food—" "I'll manage," she cut in quickly, voice trembling but steady. "You've already given us more time than you needed to. I won't take your charity." "Charity?" he repeated, frowning. "That's not what I meant." She looked up then, meeting his gaze full on for the first time. "Maybe not, but I won't have my children think their mother begged." Rhett opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was nothing to say. She didn't need saving, not in her mind. She just needed a chance to survive with her dignity intact. He finally tipped his hat. "You have until next week, Mrs. Carter. After that?" His words trailed off. "I understand," she whispered. Rhett mounted his horse and turned back toward home. The wind whipped his coat, and snow began to fall in soft, mocking flakes. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He'd given her time, and that was more than most men would have done. But as he rode away, the sound of a child's cough followed him through the wind. And for the first time in years, Rhett Callahan, the cold, practical rancher, felt something he didn't know how to name. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pity. It was the slow, painful birth of compassion, and it scared him more than any loss he'd ever faced. The sky burned orange as the sun dipped behind the hills, leaving a dim amber light that turned the snow to dull gold. Rhett Callahan had meant to stay home that evening, but something restless inside him refused to let him sit still. Every time he tried to read or pour himself another glass of whiskey, he saw Clara Carter's thin hands and the hollow faces of her children. By the time he saddled his horse, the light was nearly gone. He told himself he was just checking the property before the storm forecast for the next few days. He didn't need to see her. He only wanted to make sure she and the children hadn't already left. That was all. But the truth, the quiet truth he wouldn't name, was that he needed to see for himself that they were still all right. The Hollow Creek homestead looked even smaller in the dusk. No lamp burned in the window, only the faintest thread of smoke curling from the chimney. He dismounted silently, his boots crunching on the snow. The door was cracked just slightly open, letting out a thread of lamplight. He took a few steps, closer, and then stopped when he heard voices, small, tired voices. Through the gap, he saw them. The family sat around the rough-hewn table, 6 mismatched bowls spread before them. In the center was a crust of bread, torn into uneven pieces, and what looked like the last of a pot of stew, a thin broth with a few potato skins floating in it. Clara moved slowly, her face ghostly in the lamplight. She spooned out portions with careful precision, setting aside the smallest bowl. "Eat slowly," she told the children gently. "There'll be more tomorrow." But Rhett could see there wouldn't be. The youngest child, a girl no older than 3, pushed her bowl toward her mother. "Mama, you didn't take none." Clara smiled faintly. "Mama's already eaten, darling. You go on now." It wasn't true. Rhett could tell by the way her hands trembled, by the way she pressed her lips together, swallowing back hunger. She tore a crumb from the crust and pretended to chew, her eyes on her children as though their full bellies, such as they were worth her own emptiness. Something inside Rhett shifted painfully. He'd seen hardship before, dust storms, droughts, sickness, but nothing like this quiet sacrifice. This wasn't a woman too proud to beg. This was a woman who'd rather starve than let her children see her weakness. He stepped back into the shadows, the cold biting through his coat. He couldn't bear to walk in there, to tell her again about the debt or offer charity she'd refuse. He could only stand for a moment, staring at that fragile picture of endurance, feeling the kind of shame that burns deep, not for what you've done, but for what you've failed to do. By the time he turned back to his horse, he'd made up his mind. He rummaged through his saddlebag, jerky, a loaf of bread, dried apples, even a small pouch of flour he'd bought from town that morning. It wasn't much, but to a starving family, it would be more than gold. He walked quietly to the porch, his breath fogging in the air. He set the food near the door, careful not to make a sound. The last thing he wanted was her pride getting in the way. He hesitated only a moment before adding a folded note. For the children, from a neighbor. He didn't sign his name. Then he turned and walked away, the snow muffling his footsteps. When he reached the bend in the road, he glanced back once. The door had opened, and in the soft glow he saw Clara bend to pick up the bundle. She looked around, puzzled, scanning the darkness as if she sensed someone watching. Then she clutched the food to her chest, her shoulders shaking, and slipped inside. Rhett turned away quickly, throat tight, and rode into the night. He'd come to take land. Instead, he'd left something of himself behind, and for the first time. In years, Rhett Callahan, cold, wealthy, self-made, felt poorer than he'd ever been. The first flakes began to fall 2 days after Rhett left the bundle on Clara Carter's porch. By dawn, the wind howled down from the north, carrying with it the full rage of winter. The sky turned the color of steel, and the plains disappeared beneath a sheet of white. At the Callahan Ranch, Rhett stood by the window, watching the storm swallow the horizon. The snow came thick, blinding, sweeping across the land with a fury that made even his ranch hands curse and rush the cattle into shelter. But Rhett's thoughts weren't on his herd. They were miles away, in a small, fragile farmhouse with 5 hungry children and a widow too proud to ask for help. He tried to push the thought aside, but it clung to him. All day, as he checked the barns and fed the horses, her face haunted him, the thin curve of her shoulders, the way she'd smiled through exhaustion. By evening, his unease had turned into something sharper, fear. The wind screamed against the walls. "Boss!" his foreman, Cal Jenkins, called from the doorway. "Ain't safe to be riding out tonight. You can't see 10 feet in front of you." Rhett pulled on his coat anyway. "I won't be long," Cal frowned. "This about that widow over at Hollow Creek?" Rhett didn't answer, which was answer enough. He saddled his horse, a strong bay named Duke, and rode into the storm. The snow cut across his face like shards of glass. He could barely see the fence posts, but he knew the land by heart. The wind tore at him, and the cold sank deep. But the image of those children huddled by a dying fire pushed him onward. It took over an hour to reach the Carter place, a ride that should have taken half that time. When he arrived, what he saw turned his blood to ice. The roof of the barn had collapsed under the snow. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, but it was faint. Too faint. He dismounted, stumbling through the drifts, and pounded on the door. No answer. He shoved it open, and a gust of snow blew inside. The sight that met him made his heart lurch. Clara sat on the floor near the hearth, the baby cradled in her arms. Her lips were blue, her hair dusted with frost. The fire was almost dead, nothing but embers glowing in the ash. The older children were wrapped together under a quilt, shivering, faces pale with cold. "Clara!" Rhett crossed the room in 2 strides. She blinked up at him in shock, her breath coming shallow. "Mr. Callahan?" she whispered, voice faint. "You shouldn't be here." "It's too dangerous." "I could say the same to you," he growled, kneeling beside her. He felt the baby's cheek, cold but alive. "You can't stay here." "You'll freeze before morning." She shook her head weakly. "We'll manage. We always do." He didn't argue. There was no time. "Get your things. Blankets, whatever you can carry." She hesitated. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he said firmly. His tone left no room for refusal. "Now move." Together they wrapped the children in blankets and carried them out into the blizzard. Rhett lifted the 2 youngest into his arms while Clara guided the others. Duke, loyal and steady, stood against the storm as Rhett helped them into the saddle. He wrapped an arm around Clara to keep her from slipping, and the horse trudged forward through snow that reached its belly. The ride back to the Callahan ranch felt endless. Rhett's hands were numb. His face burned with cold, but he kept whispering to keep her awake. "Almost there. Just hold on." At last, the lantern lights of the ranch house came into view through the swirling snow. Cal and the hands rushed out to help, pulling the half-frozen family inside. Blankets, fire, hot broth. It all blurred together. Later, when Clara's children were asleep by the hearth and she finally opened her eyes again, Rhett sat beside her. His hair was wet with melted snow, his hands raw. She looked at him, confusion and gratitude warring in her gaze. "Why did you come?" she asked softly. Rhett looked into the flames, his voice rough. "Because I couldn't not come. Outside, the storm still howled, but inside that room, something warm began to stir. A small, flickering spark neither of them could name. When dawn broke over Callahan Ranch, the storm had finally spent itself. The world outside lay buried in snow, a silent, glittering expanse of white. Inside, however, warmth flickered again, crackling fires, steaming kettles, and the sound of soft breathing as Clara Carter's children slept before the hearth. Rhett Callahan stood at the doorway, his broad frame filling the entrance, watching the small family bundled in borrowed blankets. They looked out of place in his fine ranch house, like a fragile dream that might vanish if he breathed too loud. He had brought them here on instinct, not reason. Yet now, looking at the 5 children and their pale, exhausted mother, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Clara stirred awake first. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, then alarmed as she took in her surroundings, the polished wood floors, the mounted rifles, the high ceilings. "Where are we?" she whispered. "You're safe," Rhett said from the doorway. "At my ranch." Her gaze found him, wary but grateful. "You shouldn't have risked yourself in that storm, Mr. Callahan. We would have managed somehow." He crossed his arms, the faintest trace of a wry smile ghosting across his face. "You call freezing to death managing?" Clara flushed and looked down, smoothing the quilt across her lap. "You've already done too much for us. I don't know how I'll ever repay—" "You won't," he interrupted gently. "This isn't about a debt anymore." The words seemed to hang in the air between them. Clara didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Rhett handed her a steaming mug of coffee and turned toward the kitchen, leaving her to gather her thoughts. Over the next few days, the ranch came alive in a way it hadn't for years. Rhett's household staff, a cook, 2 hands, and his foreman, Cal, quickly adjusted to the presence of children. The youngest giggled at Duke, Rhett's horse, through the stable fence. The older 2 helped Cal carry wood and sweep snow off the porch. Clara, true to her nature, refused to be idle. By the 3rd morning, she was in the kitchen before sunrise, apron tied neatly, helping the cook prepare breakfast. Rhett found her there, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour, humming softly to herself. It was a sound he hadn't realized he missed until that moment. Music in a house that had been silent for too long. "You don't need to work," he said. leaning on the door frame. She didn't look up from kneading the dough. "I can't sit around while others feed my children. You took us in when you didn't have to. I'll earn our keep." Rhett wanted to argue, but the quiet determination in her voice stopped him. So he nodded instead. "Then at least let someone else chop the wood. You'll freeze those hands off." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "You sound like you've been scolding people your whole life." "Mr. Callahan. Only the stubborn ones," he said, and their eyes met briefly, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Days turned into a week. The snow melted slowly from the eaves, and laughter began to echo through the big house. Rhett found himself lingering in rooms he used to avoid: the parlor, where Clara mended clothes by the fire; the kitchen, where the smell of stew filled the air; the front porch, where the children played in the snow. Cal noticed the change before Rhett did. "You smile more these days," the old foreman remarked one evening. "And you ain't barked at a soul since that woman showed up." Rhett scowled, though not convincingly. "You talk too much, Cal." Cal grinned. "Ain't talking. Just observing." But Rhett couldn't deny it. Something inside him had softened. The sharp edges dulled by years of solitude were wearing down in the warmth of family life, one he hadn't known he missed until it was right there in front of him. Still, Clara remained careful, distant in certain ways. Her gratitude was clear, but so was her unease. She didn't belong here. At least that's what she kept telling herself. She was a widow, a debtor, a burden. And Rhett Callahan was a man of means and reputation. But as she watched him gently lift her youngest daughter to place her on Duke's back, steadying her small hands on the reins, Clara realized something unsettling. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. And worse, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. By the time the snow began to thaw and muddy ruts cut through the valley roads, word had already spread far beyond Callahan Ranch. In small towns, gossip traveled faster than the wind, and the story of the widow and the wealthy rancher was on every pair of lips from the mercantile to the church steps. Some said Rhett Callahan had finally lost his senses. That loneliness had driven him soft. Others whispered that the widow had trapped him with her sob story and her hungry brood. No one knew the truth, but the truth mattered little in towns like theirs. Whispers had a way of turning into facts before sundown. Clara Carter didn't hear the talk at first. She was too busy keeping the children clean, cooking for the ranch hands, and tending to small chores around the big house. Her days were full, her nights long, and for the first time in months, she and her children were warm and fed. It was enough. Or so she told herself. But gossip has a cruel way of finding its way to those it aims to wound. One afternoon, Clara took the wagon into town to buy sewing supplies and soap. The trip was her first alone since the storm. Rhett had offered to go himself, but she insisted, partly out of pride, partly out of a need to prove she could still stand on her own 2 feet. The general store smelled of tobacco, coffee, and sawdust. Clara picked her items carefully, counting the coins Rhett had pressed into her hand before she left. When she reached the counter, she noticed the sudden quiet. The 2 women who had been whispering near the shelves turned their backs to her, but not before she caught a few sharp words. "Living under his roof, no ring on her hand?" "5 children, and she's already warming his bed, you'll see." The heat rushed to her cheeks. Her fingers trembled as she placed the spool of thread on the counter. The shopkeeper, old Mr. Whitlow, cleared his throat awkwardly, avoiding her gaze. "Cold day out there, Mrs. Carter," he muttered. "Yes," she said softly, voice barely steady. "Very cold." Outside, she climbed into the wagon, her throat tight with humiliation. The words followed her, ghosts whispering in her mind. "Warming his bed?" "Playing the poor widow." Each one felt like a slap. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the snow pink and gold. Rhett was in the corral, training a young colt. He waved when he saw her, but the sight of his easy smile only deepened the ache in her chest. She climbed down from the wagon without returning the gesture. "Everything all right?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. She shook her head. "Rhett, I need to talk to you." He frowned. "What's wrong?" She took a shaky breath. "This arrangement, it can't continue." He stared at her, stunned. "Arrangement?" I can't stay here, she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. It isn't right. People are talking. Let them, he said firmly. You and those children have a roof, food, and warmth. That's all that matters. Her eyes filled, not with gratitude this time, but with pain. You don't understand. They're saying things about us, that I'm taking advantage of you, that you brought me here for reasons that aren't decent. Rhett's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. They've got no right. They don't need a right, she whispered. Just their tongues. He took a step closer, voice low. Do you think I care what they say? I think I do, she said softly. And that's why I need to leave, before your name's dragged through the mud. For a long moment, silence hung between them. The only sound was the wind and the soft snort of the colt behind him. Finally, Rhett spoke, his voice rough. You owe me nothing, Clara. But if you walk out that gate, you're taking more than your things. You're taking the only peace I've known in years. Her lips trembled. You've done enough, Rhett. Please, don't make this harder. Then she turned and walked toward the house, the twilight swallowing her figure. Rhett stood there, fists clenched, watching her go, helpless against the one force he couldn't fight, her pride. The air had turned bitter again, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and lingered there. Clara moved through the ranch house like a ghost, quieter than before. Ever since that talk in the corral, something unspoken hung between her and Rhett, like frost on glass, delicate but impossible to ignore. She went about her chores with mechanical precision, mending shirts, sweeping floors, feeding the children, but her eyes rarely met his anymore. Rhett, for his part, gave her space. He told himself it was respect, but truthfully, it was fear. He was afraid that if he pushed too hard, she'd be gone for good. Then one night, everything changed. The wind howled through the valley, fierce and dry. Clara had just tucked the youngest two into bed when she caught a faint, acrid scent. Smoke. At first, she thought it was just the fireplace, but then came shouting from outside, "Fire! The barn's burning!" Her heart leapt into her throat. She rushed to the window. The night sky glowed orange, smoke curling upward like a living thing. Without hesitation, she threw on her shawl and ran into the bitter cold. The scene outside was chaos. Flames licked up the sides of the barn, roaring louder with every gust of wind. The ranch hands were already there, forming a frantic line from the water troughs. Rhett was at the center of it all, his voice booming commands, face streaked with soot. "Get the horses out first," he shouted. Clara ran toward him, skirts whipping around her legs. "What can I do?" she yelled over the roar. "Get the children inside! It's too dangerous out here!" "I already did," she called back. "Tell me what else." Before he could answer, a terrified whinny cut through the night. One of the younger horses, Duke's filly, was trapped inside, kicking against the burning stall. Rhett swore and started toward the entrance, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Rhett, you'll be killed!" "She'll be dead if I don't," he snapped. And then he was gone, vanishing into the smoke. Clara's scream was swallowed by the wind. She could barely see through the thick, choking haze. Her lungs burned, tears streaming down her face. For one awful moment, she thought he wouldn't come back out. Then, he did. Rhett stumbled through the doorway, half carrying, half dragging the terrified filly. The flames behind him flared, lighting his figure like a shadow from hell. His coat caught fire at the hem, but he didn't stop until he'd gotten the horse clear. Clara rushed forward, beating at the flames with her shawl, hands blistering from the heat. When the fire was finally under control, the barn stood half-collapsed, smoldering and blackened. The horses huddled in the corral, wide-eyed but alive. The men slumped in exhaustion, coughing and wiping soot from their faces. Rhett sat on the ground, back against a fence post, breathing hard. His arm was scorched, his shirt torn, but his eyes were steady. Clara knelt beside him, trembling. "You fool," she whispered, tears cutting through the ash on her cheeks. "You could have died." He gave a weary smile. "Wouldn't be the worst way to go. Saving something worth saving." Her hand pressed against his burned arm, firm but tender. "Don't say that. Don't you dare." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just the frightened widow or the burdened mother, but the fierce, stubborn woman who had faced storms and scorn and still refused to break. "Clara," he murmured, "you and those children, you're the only thing keeping this place alive." She shook her head, voice breaking. "Don't say things you'll regret later." "I never say what I don't mean." Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. She wanted to look away, to shield herself from the warmth in his eyes, but couldn't. And in that fragile, smoky moment, something in Clara's heart gave way. She saw in Rhett what she had tried to deny for weeks, a man not trying to rescue her, but to share her burden. He wasn't her savior. He was her match in fire and will. Later, when the children were asleep and the ranch hands gone to bed, Clara found herself lingering by the window, watching the last sparks die out. Rhett's silhouette moved in the yard, checking the fences, steady and strong even in exhaustion. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, whispering to the empty night, "Don't you dare make me care for you, Rhett Callahan," but it was too late. She already did. The morning after the fire dawned gray and heavy, the air still carrying the bitter scent of smoke. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the pale horizon, and the ranch lay hushed, as if the land itself were catching its breath. Inside the house, the children slept soundly, unaware of the decision forming in their mother's heart. Clara stood by the window, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She watched Rhett outside, his arm bandaged, giving quiet orders to the men as they began clearing the wreckage. He moved slower than usual, pain etched into his features, but his determination never faltered. He had nearly died the night before, and the sight of it haunted her still. She knew now what she had been too afraid to admit. She cared for him deeply. And that was exactly why she had to go. When she looked at Rhett, she saw more than a man. She saw a life she had no right to. A wealthy rancher, respected by all, burdened already by whispers because of her presence. She couldn't let her heart drag him down further, so she made up her mind. By mid-morning, Clara began packing quietly. A few clothes, some dried food, and the coins Rhett had once given her. She folded each child's blanket with trembling hands, pausing every few moments to steady her breath. The older children sensed something in the air, something final, but said nothing. "Are we going somewhere, Mama?" little Grace asked, clutching her doll. Clara forced a smile. "Just a short trip, sweetheart. Somewhere warmer." But when she turned away, tears slipped down her cheeks. Outside, Rhett finished with the men and headed toward the house. He stopped short when he saw the wagon hitched near the porch, half loaded with bundles. His stomach dropped. "Clara?" She froze, her back to him. Slowly she turned, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "We need to leave, Rhett." He frowned, stepping closer. "Leave? Why now?" "Because I can't stay here anymore." His voice softened, but there was an edge to it. "This about the gossip again?" "It's not just that," she said, shaking her head. "It's everything. This isn't my place. I'm not your responsibility." "You think that's what you are?" he asked, incredulous. "A responsibility?" Her silence was answer enough. Rhett exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Clara, that night, when I went into that burning barn, I didn't do it out of duty. I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of losing anything that mattered to you. Doesn't that tell you something?" "It tells me you're kind," she whispered. Too kind for your own good." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No, it tells you I care. And maybe that scares you more than any fire ever could." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. "It does," she admitted softly. "Because caring for you means risking everything I've managed to hold together." Rhett stared at her, chest tightening. "Then stay. Let me shoulder some of that risk with you." But she shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "If I stay, I'll never find the courage to leave. And one day you'll look at me and wonder why you ever took in a broken widow with 5 mouths to feed." "You think so little of me?" he asked quietly. I think too much of you, she said. That's why I have to go. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to hold still. The wind, the trees, even the smoke rising from the smoldering ruins. Finally, Rhett nodded, jaw tight. If you've made up your mind, I won't stop you. She turned away before her resolve could crumble. The children climbed into the wagon, confusion and sadness clouding their faces. Clara took one last look. At the ranch, the snow-dusted hills, the charred barn, and the man standing motionless by the gate. Thank you, she whispered. He tipped his hat, his eyes unreadable. Safe travels, Mrs. Carter. And just like that, the wagon rolled away, creaking down the frozen path. Rhett stood there until they vanished beyond the rise, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Inside, the house felt emptier than it ever had. The laughter was gone. The warmth was gone. Only the faint scent of Clara's bread lingered in the air, a ghost of what could have been. That night, Rhett sat alone by the dying hearth, staring into the ashes. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Let her go free, let her choose her own life. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't lost her because she didn't care. He'd lost her because she did. The road back to town was long and silent. The children dozed under worn blankets, their little faces pale from the cold. Clara sat rigid on the wagon seat, hands clenched around the reins, heart heavier than any weight the horses pulled. Each mile away from Callahan Ranch felt like tearing a piece of herself loose. She told herself she had done the right thing. She repeated it over and over like a prayer, but it sounded hollow against the steady creak of the wheels. Leaving Rhett Callahan's home was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it brought a loneliness she hadn't felt even in her darkest widow's days. When they reached town, the same eyes that had whispered about her before now watched her return with smug satisfaction. The widow was back, still poor, still unwanted. Clara felt the sting of it, but held her head high. She rented a small cabin on the edge of town and began sewing for coin again, making dresses, mending shirts, doing anything she could to keep her children fed. At night, after the children were asleep, she'd sit by the fire, staring at the empty space beside her. Sometimes she'd catch herself setting out an extra cup of tea, as if expecting him to walk in, hat in hand, that quiet strength in his eyes. She'd shake her head, curse her foolish heart, and snuff out the lamp. Meanwhile, back at Callahan Ranch, Rhett moved like a man half alive. The house was silent again. Too silent. The laughter that once echoed in the halls was gone, replaced by the hollow clatter of his boots on the floorboards. Even the men worked in a strange quiet. They didn't ask where she'd gone. They already knew. Cal tried once to speak sense to him. You let her walk out, boss. You could still ride after her. Rhett didn't look up from the paperwork spread before him. If she wanted to be found, she'd have stayed. But Cal only shook his head. Sometimes folks leave hoping someone will come after them. Rhett said nothing. He just stared out the window, past the fields, toward the distant line of hills where the wagon had disappeared weeks before. Winter thawed into spring. The grass grew tall again, the rivers ran swift, and the air filled with the sweet scent of new beginnings. But for Rhett, the world stayed gray. Every sunrise was another reminder that she wasn't there. Then, one rainy afternoon, a knock came at the door. When Rhett opened it, a familiar face greeted him, Tom Harper, the town sheriff. His hat dripped water onto the porch, and his voice was grim. There was a sickness in town. Nothing serious for most, but it's hit hard on the weak. Clara Carter and her little ones are among those down with fever. Rhett didn't wait to hear more. Within the hour, he was saddled and riding through the storm. The rain lashed his face, but he didn't care. The only thought in his mind was her. When he reached the cabin, the sight stopped him cold. The roof leaked, the porch sagged, and the faint light from within flickered like a dying ember. He burst through the door. Clara sat by the hearth, pale and exhausted, trying to cool her son's forehead with a damp cloth. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Rhett," she whispered, voice weak. "What are you—" "Quiet now," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "You're burning up." "It's just the children," she murmured. "They got sick first." "I know," he said, already lifting her son in his arms. "I've got a wagon outside. We're going home." She tried to protest, but the fight was gone from her. He gathered the others, wrapped them in blankets, and led them out into the rain. Back at the ranch, Rhett's men sprang into action. Fires were lit, beds prepared, and the doctor summoned. For days, he barely slept, tending to Clara and the children, refusing to leave their side. Slowly, the fever broke. The children's color returned. And one morning, when the dawn light spilled across the floor, Clara woke to find Rhett slumped in a chair beside her bed, asleep, his hand still holding hers. Her breath caught. Gently, she traced her fingers over his calloused knuckles. "You fool," she whispered. "You came for me." His eyes opened at her voice, and a slow smile touched his lips. "Took me long enough, didn't it?" Tears welled in her eyes, this time not from sorrow, but from something fierce and alive. "You shouldn't have—" "I told you once," he interrupted softly. "You and those children are the only thing keeping this place alive. I meant it." She looked at him for a long time, then smiled through her tears. "Then maybe it's time we both stopped running." He squeezed her hand. "Welcome home, Clara." And as the morning sun warmed the room, the ranch came alive once more. This time not with pity or pride, but with the quiet strength of love hard-earned, born from loss and fire and forgiveness. "Home at last,"